Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's your host, John Scardina. I am so excited for this episode. So long we have been talking about branding and upping the game of emergency management across the field. We've addressed the topics of lack of definition. We've created a definition. Emergency management is strategic coordination of emergency services. We've addressed issues like first responder versus second responder and how that's BS, and how we are if we're getting the call in the middle of the night, of course we're first responders. All that stuff. We are addressing the fact that we need to move on from moldable clay to determining what we are as a field so that our stakeholders can recognize us, know who we are when we show up on scene, appreciate what we can do. And a big part of that is recognizing that we need to have brand consistency. We need to up our game on, even our presentation style. How many times have we said death by PowerPoint? Well, sometimes I die just by looking at what's on the screen, let alone the 87 slides that we have to go through. So with all that in mind, I have asked a couple of experts who have been helping me out on the Readiness Lab with Doberman, all things. They're really, really great designers. They are the founders of Noble Creative Co. Noble is going to be on this podcast, these founders, Landon and CJ, in a second. And I just want you to think about what they're saying and how it applies to you, whether you're in the public sector and you have some brand standards, or you're trying to create challenge coins, or you're in the private sector and you work for a big corporation like Nike and they're telling you what you can do. Across the spectrum, we all need to up our game, and they're going to talk about how to do that. So right now I'm going to add Landon and CJ to the podcast. Guys, thank you so much for joining me on the show right now.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, all right. Noble Creative Collective. Oops. You got to make sure we get that one right. Yeah, you guys are cool.
We're still a company.
Yeah, you're the co. So even before we started podcasting, this is like how detailed these guys are. It's really great. So I had my name. If you're looking at the YouTube video, like I had my name, and then I had podcast host under it. And they even had differences of like how they put that on there. And so they had a quick discussion, got a brand consistency here. So I just appreciate you guys' level of detail and making things look so much better. And from like all aspects. And so before we even get into the podcast recording perspective, right, of like what we're trying to, the meat of the conversation is, why for you is design so important? Like, why did you get into design?
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, design is about visual communication. It's design is like everything around us. We when you drive down the street and you see a road sign, that's graphic design. When you are looking for directions, that's graphic design. Everything is designed. Every app that you use is designed. And so it's really important to communicate clearly. And, you mentioned strategy earlier. Strategy 100% applies to design as well. And it's important that design is strategic. And so for us, I think I'll speak for myself. What really drew me to design is, there's an artistic aspect to it. And I think a lot of people just think design is fun. It's just a fun artsy, medium. But what I also like about it is that strategic part. It's really problem solving. We take design problems, so things that challenges that arise out in the world, and we find a way to design it so that people can understand things better. So yeah, at the end of the day, I say visual communication is a big part of that. And I think another part of that too is, when you think of like branding is like, often associated with just a logo, like, oh, I need a new brand. And it's really, you just want a logo. And, a logo is a part of branding, and it's an important part of branding. And I kind of refer to it as like the face of the brand. It's kind of like what you see first, what you interact with first, and what you feel first. But a brand is really so much more than that. And a brand, if you think of brands like we were just talking to a client the other day about the San Diego Zoo, and how that zoo is so much more than just a zoo, and it's so much more than just a logo. And our client described it as like Disneyland for, zoos. It's like there's so much that goes into it, from the way that you interact with people, the people that are on the grounds, talking to you, asking if you need help, to the merchandise, to the logo, to the way the exhibits are displayed. All of that creates a brand. And so a brand is really like the feeling of
Hmm.
an organization or a company.
I'm gonna go pull back here real quick because you said that it's like problem solving and strategic. That
Yeah.
is like emergency management 101, and yet somehow emergency managers are I'm calling everybody out. So bad at this. Like we all like problem solving and we like communication. We talk about communication is so important. And yet when I hired you guys, I was showing you examples of what was in the field. I was like, this is what we have to work with.
Right.
And immediately was like, no. Like it like hurt to look at, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think I funny enough, I actually don't know. We should probably do a survey if emergency managers are aware of it or they are not aware of it. And if they are aware of it, they don't have the time. They have so many other things on their plate, and they don't have a template. Funny enough, to follow down to make really amazing things following a brand, or they're like, it's just some artsy thing. Oh, why isn't anybody interacting with my post? I don't
Right.
know. You tell me. You know,
Right.
so it's
Yeah.
an interesting you know dual problem. And maybe after this podcast, maybe all emergency managers, because they like that problem solving, they'll leave the field and finally do something fun like design. So this could really backfire in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think, just like you would, plan things out from an emergency manager standpoint, that's how we approach design too. We kind of plan, we do our research at the beginning. We try to understand again the problem,
Mm,
especially when it does come to branding. We try to understand like what are we trying to accomplish here? Because we have no goal if we have nothing that we're trying to accomplish,
mm.
then there's really no point. We're just kind of just drawing and making fun stuff. So there has to be kind of a goal, and we'll kind of touch on that a little bit later too. But
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the big things too that a lot of people actually get wrong with branding, it happens very early on, is they try to solve the wrong problem and then they go too far with the wrong problem. So one
Wait,
thing is
CJ, to go on the wrong problem. I could use that. All
there you go.
right.
So that's one of the big things is like, especially in branding, we find that a lot of people want to solve their problem, but what you have to solve is your audience's problem. It's
Ooh,
not
I love
like
that.
your brand should be what you want, but you should entice the audience because that's who's going to make your brand your brand. So
Mm,
as much as you need to visually like it, it has to resonate. So like, I think that's where it kind of goes wrong, is where you'll see when people do branding and they're like, well, I want it to be red. I'm like, yeah, but like, if that doesn't resonate with the people who you want this brand to be for, red's not going to work. So you need to really think about these problems. And I think that's where design really speaks to me, because I love solving problems, but figuring out the problem is like the first big step.
Yeah, so I don't know if the audience is aware of this or not, but my wife is also a professional graphic designer and has a lot of accolades to her name as well. And maybe we should have her on here sometime. But the challenge coin that we made for the national strike team, they had asked me, because they knew about my wife, to design the coin. And there was the team lead was a narcissist, and we had made 4 versions, and 3 of the versions were for communicating to the audience of who'd be given the coin to, and just like creating that feeling. And one coin was like a nod to Texas, had nothing to do with what we were doing. And lo and behold, who knew? The team lead had 51% of the vote, and that's the coin we went with. And but at the same time, it got the coin made, right? And so there's some strategic approach there. Now the coin does look kind of cool because, of course, my wife designed it. But thinking about the audience and who's going to choose that, so many people want to. And even in, I've had this same problem. I've had to like work through that emotionally, even of like, oh, I think this looks really amazing. The audience has no idea what this means, right? And
right.
so trying to convey that, how do you, like, when you were walking through the design process, that discovery phase, CJ, and when you get a client, like let's say some emergency manager at a county, like it has to be X, it has to be Y, it has to be, ones and zeros. and you're looking at it, you're like, ooh, this doesn't make sense. From a communication standpoint, from a design standpoint, how do you communicate that to them? Or how do you go about helping them understand, like, hey, there's a different perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. One thing that I always do, especially with branding, is I always start with questions and I let them hear their answers out loud so they can kind of understand the problem. Because sometimes you think of things in your head and you're like, oh, yeah, this makes sense and this makes sense. But if you're asking them, okay, why are we doing this? And they say, well, because of this. And then I'm like, see,
Mm.
your X is, I want this to make sense for these people, but your Y is, but I like this. So those don't work. So if we need to find
Mm.
the reason for everything first. So why are you doing this branding? Why is this branding going to be good? What is different between this and everything else? Like, what is your goal? And then once we get those answers, we can tell them like, okay, so what you want doesn't really match what you're trying to do. And we need to find a center point to kind of make that work. And that's how you're going to get a solid foundation for a brand. And that's how you're going to get an audience. And that's how you're going to get everything. So it really starts with asking the right questions up front, letting them hear their thoughts out loud. Because sometimes, even for me, if I'm thinking about something, it's one thing. But if I'm saying it to myself, I'll be like, yeah, that's not a good idea. Let's skip that.
A good way to do that is, and I could show it here on the screen. You ask the question, and if it sounds stupid, just stare at them long enough until they realize it's stupid. Just like, yeah. So
say it again. Say it again, but really slow this time.
Say it again really slowly.
You do that to us a lot, John.
I know.
Huh?
You do that to us a lot.
That's weird.
And there it goes.
We have such a great working relationship because you guys have learned to ask really effective questions and allow that process to happen. I have been really impressed by, like, hey, I'll listen to your idea. Let me show you some other ideas. Let me ask some clarifying questions. And it is true, as we're working on that, as we feel like we're on the same team together, it's like, oh, right, like I didn't think about this or I didn't think about that. And I think that's one of the benefits of emergency management in particular, is allowing yourself to kind of see outside the box here for a second and work with other people. A lot of emergency managers around the country, like 90% of emergency managers, are a team of one. And they don't have lots of resources, and so they need to put out things to the public. But I think the same time, the basic questions of like, who is your audience? What is the message you want to convey? What are you hoping that they do? Right? I always bring people back to intelligence is not just data. Intelligence is data that you can action. So what is the intelligence, display that you're trying to do here in terms of the visual communication? So really, really excellent points. In terms of creating a brand or really establishing a creative brief, goals, objectives, the audience, that kind of stuff. Building off of that question component, how do you actually do it, right? Like, once you figure that part out, what is the next step?
Yeah, creative briefs are essentially the backbone of a project. So it's kind of a way for everyone's expectations to be aligned. A creative brief is essentially a plan of attack for a project that requires a decent amount of research to justify your decision making. So rather than saying, I choose red because my wife likes it, the creative brief will allow us to say, we choose red because based on our research, your target audience, they're drawn to passion and energy, but also favor other bold brands. So red is a way to catch their attention, So these briefs are also a way to align you and the client on deliverable expectations, which gives clients a step-by-step guide on when we need things as well as when they're going to get things. And it saves a lot of creatives from doing more work than promised too, which is nice on our end. But yeah, creative briefs are I think they're the most vital step in a project because it kind of sets the expectation for the entire project, and without a visual goal, but it sets like a verbal goal for everything.
In terms of the emergency management language, we would probably call that a BOP, a branding operations plan.
No?
We
might adapt
that.
Hold on.
Yeah.
At least somebody's going to start laughing. Yeah. It is funny listening to you guys as we've been working together for a little while now. You're starting to use vernacular that I can understand, and I appreciate that so much. So think about understanding your audience.
Yeah. To kind of piggyback too on what CJ mentioned, I think one key thing that he said was, kind of aligning everyone, aligning the creatives and aligning your client. And to me, that kind of puts the creative brief in the position of being like a compass for your project, where you can always come back to the creative brief. It's like your foundation. And it's good for not only us as creatives to be able to say, okay, does this align with what we set out to accomplish in the first place? But it also helps us to defend our work, and not to say like, clients are always on the attack, but it does help us when we have to explain why we made certain decisions. And it allows us to kind of go back to the brief and say, well, we made this creative choice because it accomplishes X for from the creative brief, or it accomplishes Y for your audience. And then when or if someone does come back and say, well, I like purple, then you can say, to CJ's point, you can say, well, looking back at the creative brief that we all agreed on, you told us these were your goals, and purple doesn't align with these goals. Purple's a nice color, but purple communicates something that maybe your brand shouldn't be communicating.
Well, let's talk about color for a second, because color theory is really fascinating to consider. In 2016, I was at Georgetown, and they had a member of the public affairs come and talk to our group. And I had brought up the fact that, coming from Ohio, and it sounds trivial. It is not trivial for people in Ohio. When they come out and every poster is blue and yellow, and nobody wants to put those posters up on their businesses of like, because they did this whole launch of like preparedness in your business, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no one's going to do that in Columbus. Not a single person. Like, you did it. If you do it on the rival colors, that's just not going to happen. Even if they believe the message. And it's so funny. And again, it sounds trivial, but knowing your audience. And when I explained that to her, she was like, I didn't know that we should have different versions. And I was like, I think that's like even a black and white version. And you guys always start, funny enough, with black and white when you build a brand. We can talk about that in a second. But like, really, color theory really is color that pulls out emotion, right? Gets you to do different things, right?
Absolutely.
We look at the easy one is, right, like McDonald's, like red and yellow makes you hungry, makes you want to eat. So
it makes you want to go there and leave, because red is like the hurry up. So it's like,
oh yeah,
it's like a fast food. That's why it works for fast food, because you come and then you go, but you get food.
I wonder if we can, in post-production, put like all the different restaurants that have red and yellow in them. And they're especially fast food. I mean, yeah, I could probably talk about that forever, right? In terms of emergency management is often trying to get people to do something safe, as well as identify us as emergency managers who could do everything for everyone. Now, at Doberman, or at the Readiness Lab, rather, we've determined that is a color. And so we do that color. Obviously, we have secondary colors, like I have the white on the shirt, for example. But, we determined that was black, right? And just for the audience perspective, why black? Black for emergency management is the perfect color, because in the real world, it represents it's nothing like anything else, therefore black. But it's also represented in art often as representing all color. Therefore, emergency managers can do everything for everyone. So black is kind of the perfect color to convey there. But funny enough, Landon, you were talking about purple. We were like, oh, maybe red and blue combining. We're like, wait, but we help out other people, like Forest Service. Now we're green. Are we brown? Are we this? Are we that? And we're not UPS. Like it was hard to actually come up with that, even from that perspective. When you guys, if you guys are giving some advice to people who are trying to come up with branding right now, in terms of color, you always start with black and white. Can you explain what black and white and maybe color theory behind kind of the messages that can be conveyed?
Yeah, I can kind of start here. We always start with black and white because it's most important for us to establish. It's most important that a design holds up in black and white first. If it's too dependent on color, then it's just not going to work. And there's a lot of
one more time. That is so important.
Yeah, definitely. I'll try to remember what I just said.
It depends on the color, it will not hold up. And that is so
Right.
important. So many people come up with like slide decks. This is
Mhm.
like even just talking about like normal presentation. And now all of a sudden they have these colors that just like hurt your eyes against the contrasting colors in the background.
Right.
And so like if you're building out your brand consistency, even in your slide decks, you want to make sure that your branding holds up, and black and white can help you out with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll touch on this a little bit later too, but there's so many design principles that need to be uh, considered when you're designing as well. And so, it allows you to focus on those things on with the logo first before even addressing color. You kind of touched on it as well, and we consider color to be sort of the emotion of the logo. And so it's kind of taking the emotion out of it at first, and you're just looking at it objectively saying, does this work? Is it readable? Is it legible from, at a small size, at large size? Does it make sense? Does it look like something else? Like, could be
Mm.
misconstrued. Um, so it really lets you kind of focus on that first, before diving into like all the feels.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, again, that's another reason why probably black and white is great for emergency management, because we're all dead inside, and so we can't make emotional decisions. And we'll cheer for that one again. Wait,
Yeah.
there's a
And
lot there.
And that's the thing too, is the color like really elicits emotion. So if we started branding with color, more often than not, a client is going to pick their favorite color and not their favorite logo, because
Oh man,
they're
that's a good point.
emotionally attached to something. And that's why it's important to really get like a brand logo that you like first, and then do that, because color is really tricky. Like, and what you think might look good might not look good to someone else. And if we talk about, like, even if you get into like web, there are like even more limitations, because some websites have like requirements for visually impaired.
Yeah.
Like, for example, me, I love the orange and blue color combination because it looks super clean and super professional, but certain
Mm.
shades of orange and on blue just don't mesh. So you have to be sure you have like proper contrast. And color is also like one of the best ways to emphasize hierarchy. So if you want to call something out, it's important. Like, it's an important thing. Putting it on a bold brand color may accomplish that. But if
Mm.
something should feel like it's secondary, like it's not important, then adding a softer color that falls back in hierarchy can help that too. So it's really, really vital, like what colors you pick and how you use them, because they're all going to say something different.
Okay, so for the people who are listening, they're like, okay, I'm in charge of my own social media posts. I'm in charge of creating, all of our presentations to senior leadership, all of that. Can maybe both of you just provide either the hierarchy or the color combinations where, like, okay, I'm listening to this. I have no design or color or anything background. I'm dead inside. I need to know what looks good on a screen. Can you give just like maybe 3, 4, 5 examples of like, do this and this and it will look good? Can you give some basic examples?
Yeah, I think one thing that CJ already mentioned a little bit is contrast. Contrast to me is one of the most important things. And
Mm.
CJ also touched on kind of accessibility, and that there may be audiences that don't see color the same way that most people do, or they may not see, you know, um, yeah, they may not be able to read color, the same way. So just having contrast is key. And one kind of trick that I kind of use is I try to stick with a kind of brighter color and then a darker color. That's kind of the easiest
Mm.
way to get that contrast. But even with that, to CJ's point, sometimes those color combinations don't work. So finding something that is objectively contrasting, and also maybe running it by sort of like a color blind checker or something, where you can ensure that people that don't see color the same way, that it still contrasts well for them.
When you say a colorblind checker, you're not talking about an individual. You're talking about an application, or
Yeah, I think there's I think that there's resources available that allow you to kind of check those things.
Mhm.
But I know for a fact that there are contrast checkers, color contrast analyzers, that are specifically used for, I think it's like
Again,
WCA
sorry,
digital
I'm
prints.
confused. When you say analyzers, are you talking about a software? Or are you talking about people who analyze
Yes, the analyzer specifically. I'm talking about a software.
a software? Okay. I'm like, you said yes, but okay, you're gonna answer
Yeah.
this question for me right now because it's driving me crazy for such a long time. red and blue. I love both those colors, and it's such a nod to emergency services, but they look so awfully bad with each other often unless I make that blue so incredibly dark, right? And
Right.
so, like, even contrasting colors again, very specifically here, white and black always look good together. It's such either or, right? Like, that's such an easy one to determine. Are there other ones that are really obvious? CJ, you brought up maybe like an orange background with blue text. Certain blues, not like
Yeah.
cobalt, but
Yeah, and I think the key there is sort of why white and black work. So you have like the brightest and the darkest. So if you're going to have like what Landon said, if you have one color on each side, it's likely going to work. So if you have like a really dark blue and a light red, that's going to sit well. But if when you have those middle colors that are close, like the middle red and the middle blue, those things are going to vibrate. Like, and by vibrate we mean when you look at something and it kind of like looks like fuzzy or like a little
like your background.
yeah, like exactly. Like this. It's because I didn't mix my colors right.
You didn't mix your colors. Is that
All
what
red and
doing on the
blue.
screen is mixing the colors? Yeah.
One tip I will give people though who are doing social media, if you are going to pick your own colors, again, pick a dark color. So for example, here we could do like, let's just say we have like a purple, like a dark purple, and then you want to pick something like a gold. Those are going to contrast well. And if you want something to fall in the middle, it's always safe to use something. I would never go more than 3 colors if it was me, because it's going to deter attention. It's going to look like you're not going to know where I should go. Exactly. So you can always add like a white if it's a dark background, or like a dark gray if it's a light background. Or if you have like a dark purple and you're using a white, you can always use like a medium purple to kind of have something that falls back, because white is going to stand out a lot on dark. But if you have a medium color, it's kind of like a secondary information color, I guess you can call it, where it doesn't really stand out, but it's there for like almost like a subtext. So I would say don't go more than 3 colors, including white and black. And if you do have a middle color, make sure that's your like subtext. That's, and you can even pick it from whatever your darkest or lightest background color is, and then just go like 50% of that and then kind of toy around with it and see how it looks. But that's a good way to kind of have like a balance.
Yeah, I think that's just excellent advice. Your lightest version and your darkest version as your contrast, and then a middle as the subtext, and 3 colors max. There's I'm guilty of this too. I'm like, oh well, I'm conveying 15 different things, so my bullet points are going to be one color. My background is going to be like 50 different colors of of the scene because it's a picture of something. Even yesterday, I posted about the train disaster in Ohio, and I really wanted to use an image of the train disaster because it's obvious, right? But I wanted to start adding a lot of colors, and I showed my wife, and she's like, "Honestly, you should just do a black bar at the top and then the white text." I didn't technically listen to her, and I posted it anyways. But I did do the outline. But what I did do is I followed the principle where I changed the image so that all the smoke from the fire was at the top, so it was really, really dark. And then, I did the text as contrasting that. It was much easier to see rather than just trying to do that. And I think in terms of a design principle, one of the things I've learned in terms of presentation styles is like always remembering the audience of what you try to convey. One problem that we have in terms of just this is kind of off topic a little bit is we feel as we have to put all the text, all the things on the screen. If you're trying to talk about the train disaster in your presentation, it sounds so much better, it looks so much better by just having the picture only on the screen and then talking, because you're there to present anyways. You're not there for people to read the screen.
Right.
And that's like one tip I always give people is if you're going to have pictures in your presentation, don't put any text on that picture. Don't even try to explain what's on the picture because you will be naturally doing that. And it should really be a cue to you anyway. So contrasting colors, making sure whatever the focal point is, i.e. the picture and or the backgrounds, really, really great information so far on that. In terms of hierarchy, one problem I've seen is that that we need to address is fonts, font types, and consistency of font. People forget often. They're like, oh, I wrote this up in Word. Default is Arial, for example, they forget that there might be a brand standard for their organization, or even worse, if it's government, it's like always Times New Roman, and it's like it dies, right?
Right.
So, what are some options where maybe a professional font that you could give where they're like, hey, try these different options where it might make your publications pop a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think there's a lot of things to kind of touch on here, but much like color, I mean, just to kind of tie it back real quick, if you have, I think you mentioned, John, like if you have every color of the rainbow in your presentation, if you have, a red here and a blue here and a green here and all these different colors, like we go back to talking about color as emotion. So like, what does that communicate? It communicates a whole slew of emotions. And it's almost like that thing where if it's kind of like the boy who cried wolf. Like if you just keep, if everything's important, then nothing's important, So if everything's colorful, then nothing matters anymore. And I think it's similar with, excuse me, typography as well. If you have 50 different fonts and nothing is important, nothing stands out. And I think that's kind of what you're referring to when you talk about hierarchy is what information is most important, what information falls under other information, and how are you communicating that? And hierarchy and font choices are all part of that. You asked specifically about like different types of font options, and you also mentioned Arial. And CJ and I always kind of just giggle whenever we hear that, or Times New Roman or Comic Sans is the famous one, because those are the defaults. And the thing is, everybody knows that they're the defaults, and so then there's this sort of subconscious communication that you're doing by just using the default, which is like you're not putting the effort into it to make it designed, to make it interesting. There's also all kinds of technical and scientific reasons why Arial and Times New Roman aren't great fonts. So you
Please explain them.
Okay. So let me break it down. No, I'm just kidding. No, please do your own research because if you're interested, it's very fascinating. But that being said, we always encourage and we like to use different typefaces. And by different, we mean unconventional typefaces. That doesn't mean you have to use something that looks like, a bunch of pictograms of people, for as letters or anything like ridiculously creative like that. It just means like you want to find something that's simple and effective, and it should complement the design. It shouldn't do the heavy lifting for the design. So for example, we were talking about some brands before this, and one idea that just comes to mind is like Yeti, for like the Yeti mugs or the Yeti, merchandise coolers and things. Their brand is very, very simple. Arguably maybe too simple, but like it's just a bold word, and it's just their name in a bold typeface. But that boldness, it doesn't have to be in the shape of a mug. It doesn't have to be in the shape of a cooler, to communicate the idea. The message I think that it's communicating is like it's sturdy, it's bold, it's reliable, those types of things. And so, we subconsciously kind of read into those things without having to see a picture of it. We don't have to see it literally represented. We can just see some of those defining characteristics in typography that communicates the idea. So as you're looking for type options, which by the way, if you're looking for a specific resource, Google Fonts is a great free resource for fonts.
Yeah, it's great.
They have lots of great options. But again, just don't go too crazy with all the decorative typefaces. But, just look for something that's clean. Readability is also going to be huge because so many logos try to be so clever that they end up making their name hard to read. And there's a lot of great examples out there of brands that people are like reading incorrectly, and they're like, what does that even mean? What is this? What does this company do?
Kia is a great example of that. It looks like a backwards N, like a not an A.
KN.
N. Like what's
right,
KN?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. And that's an example of trying to be a little too clever with your typography to the point where you're sacrificing readability. And readability should always be the priority. So readability first, and then finding something that delicately represents the idea and complements a logo or whichever medium you're working in.
I love that skit from NSL. SNL about what? See,
I thought you're
readability.
intentionally
Yeah.
The
swapping the letters.
papyrus.
I was watching the NFL this morning, so that's yeah. So they were talking about papyrus and how it's using the
Yes.
avatar.
Right.
That is one of the funniest skits to me
Yeah.
because he talks about like there was no effort, right? They just used
Right.
something that was already made. However, it does kind of convey the message, right? So
Yeah.
maybe not overthinking it, but it is a great skit. Maybe we'll put it in the show notes. But yeah, using papyrus for avatar.
And it can be distracting too, if people do
Yeah.
recognize it, like, they might just be distracted by it instead of it effectively communicating what they wanted to.
Yeah.
Some tips I would have for people who aren't designers. So with that being said, I think designers have a way of like manipulating type to look good on like on where we design. But if you're doing stuff for yourself and you have limited resources, like you're not fluent in Adobe programs or any of that stuff, I would say Google Fonts, like Landon said, is a great place to go. Stick with something that's like a clean sans serif, but make sure it has multiple weights so you can emphasize things that you need to. So some of my favorites, very simple, and this is for like body copy specifically. Like look for open.
You got to use vernacular that they'll body copy. All I heard was body count, and now I'm thinking like mass casualty incident. Can you explain like when we say copy, like that's like
so when you have any sort of document, you'll have a header that kind of emphasizes what the certain section's about, and body copy is like all the copy that follows header. Is basically the lowest. Yeah, all the text, all the content that's not a header or a call out. So for things like that, Google Fonts, you could use like Open Sans, which has like 10 different weights and it's really legible. You can use like Roboto, which is another good one. It has like 4 or 5 weights, I think. Montserrat, which has like 2 or 3, which is my favorite font. It's just so easy to use everywhere. Lado or Poppins is very popular. Those are fonts that are like clean. They pretty much work wherever you want. And then what you can do is if you want to try and get a little creative, you can use like a different font for your headers that is more interesting, that kind of ties more into your brand. But I think for safety, and don't be afraid to go under 12-point font. Like not everybody has that bad of
vision, we typically do 10. 10 is standard for copy in Doberman, funny enough.
Yeah. So my advice to people is go look at those just 4 fonts, play around with them. Don't feel like you're stuck on 10 or 12. Go to 10, make your headers 12, 13. But kind of play with that hierarchy, and you'll start to see some visual interest happening. And then that's just a good starting point. And try not to do, one of my things that I personally try not to do is don't ever go more than 2 fonts, at 3 at most, because then it starts getting muddy and messy and you're not sure where you're going. But that's the point of the weights. So like if you have a header font for your subheads, you can use all Open Sans because it has bold, extra bold, italic, regular, all these fonts that you can use that look cohesive, so it doesn't look like it's 3 or 4 different things. So just experiment with weights and stuff like that rather than 4 or 5 different fonts.
And let me give people an example of this in the real world. When we do memos, the hierarchy of our memos is the title is all caps, I believe 18. Then we go to and bold. Then when we do like the to and from, it is bold 12, from and to, bold, right, black, and then standard copy for the title for that titling, I think is also 12 for that, including the subject and bold. But once we get into the copy, it's all 10. And like we have additional hierarchies that we follow. Even within that, we, subheadings, bullet points, all that stuff. And we follow the same plan. People, because I'm aware of this, and this is like the one really hard thing about design is like once you start noticing it, it's like really hard not to notice it. And it's like hard to be nice about it because like if we have a new hire and they haven't learned how serious I am about this, then they'll do something and they'll just either not look at our creative brief, or they won't look at our branding operations plan, if you will, and they will just like, oh, that looks cool. I'll do some like italices, random places. I'll highlight this. I'll add this. But it's like I'm like having a seizure, and I'm like, no, we follow this plan every single time, and the reason why we follow it every single time is because it looks professional. It matches our whole branding perspective. Like the Readiness Lab uses Newhouse Grotesque, and typically it is all
Great font, by the
lowercase.
way.
What?
Great font, by the way.
Oh, it's great font. When I came up with Newhouse Grotesque so many years ago, no,
It's weird. It says here is designed by someone else, but
Go on.
no,
He's staring at us again.
yeah, just staring. You got to watch the video for this. Yeah, that is for branding, because it's a little bit more modern and it's supposed to be low key and anybody can enter. We don't typically do a lot of capitalization, so like everything is lowercase on the website. We do have bold when we want to call things out. I mean, looking at this shirt, for example, right? This shirt, if you're watching the podcast, is even following the brand consistency there of I create and live are not what we really want to call out. We're calling out emergency plans and lives depend on it. So it's just like following this methodology that the weights, as CJ is talking about, the branding, the logo is one part of that, but everything should follow within that. The font that's in the logo, I would say you should use that font most likely in all your branding. And so as you do that, your materials, without having a lot more effort, once you figure out what your hierarchy is and what your standards are, now all of a sudden it's already looking so much more professional just by following that, and you don't have to overthink it. And that, there you go. You have a huge win. You have your color weight, you have your hierarchy, you have your standards, and now you have the super professional thing, and people actually want to look at it more than half a second, right?
Yeah,
So look at call outs.
because as you all of those things that you mentioned go back to what we talked about at the beginning, like communication. It all leads to clearer communication. So being able to read things clearly, not be distracted by 50 different fonts, 50 different colors, all of these things like all contribute to clear communication.
Yeah, and speaking of communication, I want to call this one out too, and it's kind of an off thing, but there are certain fields that get a lot of feedback. There's a lot of fields that don't. One of the fields that gets a ton of feedback are designers. Like the graphic design, I have been under the gun with trying to understand what this process is, because I think it will help me out a lot. And like in sciences, it's like you apply one chemical to the other chemical and you should have the reaction. There you go. Right? Math is another way. Design is so much more of an art form that everybody, especially the amateur, right, will provide a lot of feedback, because when we don't know. Here's another really good example. When I thought of logos before, especially for emergency management, I would always go back to a mascot, because when in government we have eagles, we have the image. You look at the DoD, they always have like a mascot, but there's also logos and branding. And so it took a long time for my wife to be like, a mascot's not a logo. You're not going to be dressing up like a freaking dog running out, every time you meet with somebody. And so trying to understand, like, not overdoing it too. But that's really hard for public safety, because we're used to government seals and we're used to those kind of imageries. Even Georgetown, you look at the Georgetown logo. Oh my gosh, it was made in 1776, but it's also so complex. It's beautiful, but it is complex.
Yeah.
And so there's just a lot of things from a feedback perspective only. Emergency managers have to deal with feedback, and they have to learn to be able to take feedback. How do you guys manage the stress of putting a lot of effort into something and somebody potentially saying, I absolutely hate it, and knowing that they could be wrong, but sometimes they could be right? Right. So like, how do you manage that from a professional standpoint or a personal standpoint?
I love this question.
You
Yeah, I
secretly
think
rage at home and you're like, I haven't figured it out yet. Yeah.
yeah, CJ shakes his fist, but it's under the table so they can't see it on Zoom, you know.
There's a joke
Um,
about that, but we're gonna
Yeah,
do it
there
soon.
I don't know how he knows this.
I didn't mean it like that. No, I think it's definitely challenging because, you know, I think our field, people think that it's subjective, like art is, you know, and design is really different in that it's really not subjective. It's more objective than people think because there are so many design principles that we take into account, things that have been, you know, all but scientifically proven to be effective ways of communicating. You know, a lot of the things that we talked about today are included, but people still don't view it as being you know, objective, and so um they look at it as being subjective, and it's hard for us to have to sort of educate people every time on why we've made choices. But going back to our, you know, creative brief conversation, that is the way that we are able to sort of defend that, you know, our decisions. So, you know, and it's not all defense. It's not all us just saying, well, we did this because, you know, we know what we're talking
How
about.
dare you?
Yeah. But you know, it does help us to have a firmer ground to stand on and say, you know, this is why we made these decisions, because of these principles. That being said, you know, we do receive a lot of feedback that doesn't really apply, or we explain why we did something and frankly people don't care, you know, and they say, well,
Sounds like an emergency manager again. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
they say, you know, that's great, but I personally really like red. And so in those instances, I think what we try to do is say, which is not incorrect, but you know, we say we'll consider it. And it's an honest answer because we will consider it. And sometimes, you know, people have great suggestions that we didn't think of. And I think we're humble enough to say, like, yeah, I didn't think of that. Maybe we'll try it, you know. But that's why we say we'll consider it, because we do in some cases take it back and try it, and if it doesn't work, then we, you know, tried it. But we do consider it. It's just, you know, what we try not to do is say, yeah, that's a good idea, we'll do that, or, you know, like agree to it right off the bat, because that can lead to problems later. And at the end of the day, the other tricky thing about our field is our names are behind the design. So if you may sign off on it, you may think it's wonderful, but if we think these are all poor design choices that, you know, we've now had to make, now that's our reputation that's kind of out there, and people see that and say, oh wow, you know, Noble did that. So there's a fine balance, you know. It's definitely like give and take. And again, that's why we say we'll consider things as opposed to just right off the bat agreeing to do it, because we do need to sit down and look at it, you know, against the creative brief and make sure that it makes sense.
Do you every once in a while are you like, ooh, I know that one's not going on the website as an example?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, we definitely have.
There's nothing from Doberman on there, which is super weird.
Well,
we've done
oh
maybe
gosh,
2
is
logos
there nothing on there?
so.
There has to be something on there.
I think we have well, not necessarily Doberman, but we have movie AAR up there.
Yeah, movie R.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, I was gonna say the one thing that is, I think, important, and if somehow there's creatives listening to this too, this is vital. It's not personal. Like, it's not like, more often than not, I would say 99% of the time, clients aren't saying, CJ, you did a bad job. It's, I don't like where this is going. So it's not like, you know, it's not like it's you. It's just that they don't like what they're seeing. So like you almost have to take the you need to work emotionally, because that's kind of like where you get your ideas, and like you have to put yourself in the shoes of an audience and all that stuff. But then you have to take emotion out when it's time for critiques. And that's where constructive criticism is vital, because like in anything, like if you're a parent, you got to understand when your 3-year-old's like, I hate this food. They're not saying you're a bad cook. They're just not, they don't want the food. You know what I mean? Like they're going to eat it the next time. So it's the same thing. It's like, you got to understand when it's constructive criticism or when it's like verbal abuse, I guess. You know, it's like, sometimes it's just about the project. So like, it's not you, just take yourself out of it for a minute, put yourself in their shoes and try to understand. That being said, the client's not always right. Like if like Landon said, if you go back to the creative brief, that's when you say like, well, these are why I made my decisions and this is what we agreed upon, not because you like it. Like the worst feedback you can get from any client is, oh, my client is going to like this, so let's do this. I'm like, is your client the audience for their brand though? Like you need to really think about your audience. I'm your audience right now, not your client. Like, and I feel like more often than not, me and like the average person is going to have a good opinion on your brand because that's who you want to impress. You want to put an impression on. So your client might feel a certain way, but like that's where that communication comes in. Like, I understand what you want, but again, take a step back and think about what everybody else wants and who you're selling to. Unless this brand is just for you, then in which case, sure, we can make it whatever you want.
Yeah.
Well,
sorry. Sorry, John. You hit the nail on the head there, though, CJ. Like, I think the key there, you said, when you get constructive feedback, or maybe it was John that said that, but you don't always get constructive feedback. And sometimes you do get, subjective feedback that's just like, I don't like that, or, it reminds me of something else. But again, not to sound like a broken record, but going back to the creative brief is where that's going to be the most important, because with the subjective, unhelpful feedback or biased feedback, that's where, you kind of realign everybody and say, look, here's the objective that we're trying to accomplish. Here are the goals you set out. So does, this effectively communicate that? And, we're not always right. We're not always going to get it right. We don't always hit it right on the head. We're not saying that we're geniuses that we're not saying we're geniuses that get it right every time. But when, when we're confident that our design is based in, an objective, or based in accomplishing an objective, then we can confidently say, this is why we did this. And sometimes, people, again, hear that and don't always agree with it either. So it's not a guaranteed, success tactic, but it does help protect us a little bit.
I'm just going to come full circle here for a second. And I know we're out of time here, but I want to cover very quickly a couple different things. One, that emergency manager who's listening in right now, who's like, okay, you've explained this in kind of a strategic level perspective of establishing a creative brief. What are some really basic principles so they say, okay, I'm going to write this down right now. This is how I build out my creative brief. What do they need to write down? Because we talk about objectives, explain that just a little bit more detail for that audience member.
Yeah, I think there's objective is the biggest one that we start with. So that's right there at the top. We also break down audience, key deliverables sometimes, depending on, what the client's asking for. And we try to be as specific as possible here with sizes and quantities and things like that. But we also talk about things like tone, like what's the tone you want to convey? Or, one creative way that people sometimes do this is they talk about it in terms of like a car or a restaurant or food. Like if your brand was a car, what kind of car would it be? Or if your brand was, a dish, what ingredients would it include? Things like that. And it might sound silly, but those things do help spark, like they help to pinpoint characteristics about the brand that are otherwise kind of hard to pinpoint. We actually just kind of ran into this with a client that we asked them, for what they wanted to communicate, and they just kind of kept coming back with like adjectives about like what the logo was. So they're like, Western or something like that. And we're like, okay, but like what are you trying to communicate to people? And they're like, that we're here. It's like, maybe that's one of the things, but like, what are the things that you want to really like, what do you want people to leave with? So I think, I know we gave a few examples, or I gave a few examples, and there's a lot more that you can include in creative briefs. But at the end of the day, I think it's drilling down into like, how do you want to be perceived by people? How do you want them to look at your brand? and what do you want them to feel? Because going back to what a brand is, it really is just about feeling. Like,
Yeah.
when you go to the San Diego Zoo and you're have that feeling of excitement, it's because of a combination of things, but that feeling of excitement is what you want to accomplish. So, look at your brand from that perspective.
Yeah. The two important things, in my opinion, that I could add to that too are, like I've been preaching, know who your target audience is too, because if you understand that, you're going to have a whole pool of information to pull from, and feelings and emotions and colors and fonts and all that stuff. And then know who your competitors are, because even if you're a one-off, you're going to have people who do similar things, even if it's not the same. And I'm not saying like, oh, like size them up, but your competitors are obviously doing something right. So figure out what they're doing right, figure out what they could be doing better, and do that. Like that's how you compete. So you need to know those two things too. Know who your audience is and know who your competitors are, and really learn the ins and outs of both of them.
And from a design perspective, knowing your competitors, one piece of that too is knowing how to differentiate yourself from your competitors design wise. I mean, I think a lot of us probably know about the Olympic logo scandal several years ago, but somebody accidentally ripped off an Olympic a logo for the Olympics and got in trouble
the
for it.
Tokyo Olympics. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so that's where research comes, is the most important. Like, see what competitors are doing so that you can avoid that too, because the last thing you want to be is a copycat too.
Yeah, so let's just rounding this out now, finishing this up. Thank you again for explaining that. We are looking at you guys have done so many logos for us and so many brands for us, especially because of the podcast network. You've done the EM weekly relaunch, which is like infinitely better than what it was, and it conveys a message. You did the movie AAR podcast for us, which we need to do season 2 at some point. And it perfectly conveyed to the message. They're totally two different brands. One was supposed to be like late night at a bar, two guys talking, Zach and co-host, and people could listen in, and it feels like that. Like he's a comedian, so nod to the comedy club, the neon sign thing. Movie R was supposed to be more towards families and kids and more adventurous and movies, and it has a pirate feel. And at one point, I gotta find it, but I did buy a recorder. I am going to change the music for that. All that
Looking
stuff
forward
goes
to it.
into play. At the same time, I think about 3 logos. Actually, I'm going to back up a little bit more. You talked about how you can be different. If I'm going to do a challenge for my emergency management friends or anybody who's really listening to this podcast right now, Google FBI click images, Google law enforcement, Google police, fire, EMS, doctors, accountants, dispatch, and basically any other field, and you will see image after image after image with the same feelings, the same types, the same images, even the same logos. They're industry wide. Now Google emergency management. It is weirdly embarrassing. You get like, we kind of went through a rebranding with DHS 20 years ago. So now there's 5 phases instead of 4 phases, and there's disaster life cycle, and there's civil defense, which doesn't make any sense anymore, even though we have a nod to them because that's kind of the history of EM. We had somebody make it on PowerPoint, I'm pretty sure, the 4 stars and the EM. And so it's like it was all over the place. And so if we as an industry cannot determine what we look like, what we feel like, what we are presented as, it is no wonder to me that so many of my emergency management friends around the country, even globally, when they hire Doberman or they work with us or they just chat at conferences, they have a problem with stakeholders. Because stakeholders, if we can't determine what we look like, if we can't determine our own feelings, then they absolutely cannot, right? We have, I've been trying to kill this conversation, but it's like, oh, I don't want to define who we are because that might limit what we can do. No, if you can't define who you are, people will not see value in who you are and what you can actually bring. Rather, it's good to say, hey, here's a baseline, and off that baseline, you can make it unique from there based off of your needs and your audience types. And so with the Readiness Lab, comparative to the civil defense logo and what I call the PowerPoint logo, Hopefully that makes sense. The EM with the stars that is kind of popular. Um, uh, if you guys could help me out here, and I'll put it up on the screen for people a little bit later. Can you talk about maybe why civil defense logo doesn't make sense for us anymore? Why the EM stars doesn't really make sense, and maybe why the Readiness Lab icon, which to not your credit, unfortunately, you guys didn't make, but you're supporting us now, and you're seeing what we're trying to do with that. You're really the masterminds of all of our branding now and our merchandise. Why does civil defense? Why should we not go back to civil defense? Why should we not use the stars? And why should we use the icon? Can you talk about that for maybe 2 minutes before we jump out of here?
Yeah. So the civil defense logo, in its defense, pun intended, was made in like 1939, and it was good. It was a good logo for its times in terms
It's pretty
of
cool, actually. It's a
symbolism
cool
and
looking
simplicity.
logo. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Before CDs.
exactly. But now it just feels a little bit dated, and in today's world with brands that better construe what a logo and a brand is, it just kind of lacks any sort of feeling or emotion other than eliciting the Cold War era that it was from. So,
which
for
we're about
example,
to be into again. Shoot. So you're proving. Dang it. Should we just change? Why
we
can't
might
we
need to.
just change, for example, on the civil defense logo? Why can't we change it from CD to EM? Like it. There's a question there, right? And hopefully we can't.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing about it is, before researching it, I would have never guessed what it was for, but I knew it felt military and vintage. So without any context, I would have no idea what it was about. As an outsider, I mean, I'm sure if you were an emergency manager, you knew what the triangle stood for and the circle. But I also believe that's why so many of the biggest brands, do like a refresh and not like a whole new brand, where they update the logo rather than start over. The current emergency management logo feels a little too random. Like, I understand the three stars. I know they're like what are they? The 3-step civil defense philosophy or something like that, right?
Yeah, and we don't even have 3 anymore. We have so it's like, yeah, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, and I only know that because I looked it up. Like, otherwise, I'm like, it just looks like you just added them into the swoop, But the stars and the swoosh feel a bit clip artish, like there's no meaning or feeling or thought behind them. And I think the idea of like italicizing the EM makes sense. It makes you think of like movement and urgency. But the tagline on that one is like super small and it won't scale. And the swoosh lines, like if you look closely, they're inconsistently weighted at the top and the bottom. So there's a lot of issues with that logo. And again, as an outsider
I hate that one
in,
too, for all those reasons.
John's grinning because you're just, ripping it apart. He's like, please,
I hate
keep
that
going.
logo so much. It looks so ugly. It does. What does it even mean? Like,
I think that's one of the biggest takeaways is like, what does it represent? It kind of goes back to like what we've been talking about this whole time. And I think that one and the civil defense logos, if people have to do work to learn what your logo means, then it's not an effective logo.
Bingo. Yeah. And like the icon for EM, and again, we could put it on, it's also on my shirt, but it does look like quotes. We talk about communication, we talk about collaboration. It looks like a hazard symbol. It's simple. It can be used anywhere. It's cyclical, right? Like when I ask people who are not in emergency management, we do a dynamic populations course. We did this in Orlando. And I show them, I said, what does this mean? Oh, it looks like a hazard symbol. It looks like, revolving. It looks like things are always happening. They're naturally able to say the feelings that I want from them on it. Same thing with the Doberman logo. The triple D in the middle is kind of a nod to a dog's ear, but it's an arrow pointed forward. We're moving forward. The seal is also cyclical and has all the dots of like all the different things we do. And again, even Doberman, I don't own dogs. I'm not a dog grooming company, and that is one thing I've come up with. But when people ask me why Doberman, I say, what is a Doberman to you in terms of emergency management? They say always the same 2 things, which is why I chose the name: safety and security. Right? I want people to think that Doberman can help protect people. And so I think it's important as people think about branding and what they call their emergency management organization, because that's something they have to deal with sometimes as well. Are you an agency? Are you a group? Are you this? Are you that? Like, thinking about everything, every aspect of that really, really helps people out. And I know we're like way over time here, but this is a super fascinating topic to me. And quite frankly, the field needs to learn about it. And so, like, it's just really great call outs. As we are wrapping up, as I've said, that this is like the most Midwestern conversation here ever. We've said bye 10 times. What is your final call out to everybody who's listening to emergency services across the board? What do you hope they walk away with from this episode?
I would say I think I just hope that they have a greater understanding of the importance of design, just at a high level, and all of the thinking that goes into it. If I had a soapbox, I would stand on it and just tell everybody that, because I really think, and again, this isn't meant to sound, like self-aggrandizing, but I think like our industry is really, um, it's it's a little undervalued, and I don't think people truly understand what goes into it. And we're not, brain surgeons, of course, but like there's still a lot of thinking and strategy that goes into it. So I think my biggest takeaway that I would hope people get from this is to put that strategic thinking and planning into their design. Just give it a second look. Take a look at each piece and then look at it holistically and see how does it, what does it communicate and how is it coming across to people.
Yeah, and I would build off of that, and I would say, I think with any good business, you're going to have to invest in your business. So if you have the funds, just invest in a creative to kind of help set the boundaries for you. If you can't afford a designer forever, that's fine, but like afford one to be able to set you up to succeed at least, because I would never assume I'm an attorney and try to write all my legal paperwork for clients myself. There's no way, because I would get sued and lose everything. So you don't have to hire an attorney every day, but at least to set the boundary for a proposal, to send to clients. Trust the experts. That's what I'm going to say. Even if it's just finding 5 or 10 minutes of a designer's time to talk them, do something. But that's what we're here for. Like, we study this, like we do this for a living, and we're passionate about it, and we want to help. So like, reach out to the experts and at least get a baseline for you to succeed, because otherwise you're just cutting corners and it's going to show.
Yeah. Ultimately, an amateur will look like an amateur. Now, the hope of this podcast is that we all can up our game a little bit. At the same time, speaking of Noble, I have been so impressed by everything you guys have done. Your team, Aaron included, who is not on this podcast, and it is so effective. And we have presented to you guys so many times. We've talked to our clients about this, like, hey, hire Noble. And I don't care about other companies, right? Like, you're my company. So, like, it's so important to say, hey, I got a grant here for mass notifications. This is absolutely within that grant process. Let me hire Noble. Let me hire Creative, but Noble. I'm going to say that one more time. But hire them and say, hey, I have to establish my creative brief. I have to establish my brand standards, even if they can't afford or sustain, long-term, whatever. You guys can help them set standards and maybe templates. Say, hey, when you want to do your preparedness fair, you got it. When you need to send out something about a pending disaster, you got it. And helping them put that together, topographies, and understanding the message, because you'll ask questions that they won't be thinking about themselves. And so if you have a mass notification grant, if you have a community engagement grant, if you have recovery funds, if you're going to do any kind of like town hall meeting or any of that stuff, putting on a conference, unfortunately, don't trust your PowerPoint skills. Like, you should hire a professional, and it should be a very easy pitch to emergency managers, because we are constantly having to fight that uphill battle as well, saying, hey, I understand that you are a stakeholder in this, but you do not have the skill set to do emergency management. I'm a professional. I've been learning about this for a while. I go to school for this. The same thing should be true of you in design. And if we want to be master, communicators, then absolutely we should hire master designers. And and really look at that from your perspective. So again, Landon and CJ, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for talking to me for a really long time and letting me do the Midwest goodbye here. And maybe we'll have you on sometime. Hopefully from the audience, we can get people. It'd be really fun for people to upload their logos in like the comment section on LinkedIn or something. We can just see like if they're good, bad, or ugly or whatever. Rate my logo. .com or something. I don't know.
Constructive feedback. Don't forget.
Yeah, whatever. Let's
we'll be kind. We'll be kind.
Yeah, no, but it would be interesting, right? Like everybody upload. If you're listening to this podcast, go onto LinkedIn, upload. You can upload images there. Upload in the comment section your logos, and let's just see what we come across with the board. Are we right? Are we wrong? Have we misstepped? I'm going to say we're probably right because I have never been wrong my whole life. So we'll just take it from there. Thanks again, guys. And
yeah, thank you. It's been our
for
pleasure.
our audience, yep, like, subscribe, and we'll see you for the next one. Peace.